Hello again and welcome to another bearing removal and installation video featuring Boca bearings. Now today's engine is a recent acquisition from eBay and it looks like a pretty decent acquisition, although it's a little bit tired. And it is an ASP 40 ABC two-stroke engine. Now I'm going to throw it to the table here real quick and show you this engine before I disassemble it, and then I'll turn the video off, get it all disassembled, and get it ready for a bearing removal and replacement. Okay, so here's the subject of today's bearing removal and installation video, and as I said, this is an ASP 40 engine, and these engines basically came out in about the late 80s, and I had one. It was actually one of the first two-stroke engines that I ever purchased was an ASP 46 ABC engine, and this one looks like it's in pretty interesting or pretty decent shape. The thing I'm curious about is I've probably had 8 to 10 different ASP engines over the years, from the old original series and some of the newer series that were made in the 2000s, and I don't ever recall seeing, I know whoever put this head on here didn't put the head on correctly, I don't ever recall seeing black heads on as far as the rear cover and the case. So I don't know. This thing turns over pretty, it's got good compression, but it feels rough. And I basically wanted to kind of show these parts so I can see at the end how they cleaned up. So with that said, let me go and disassemble this engine, get it, most of it, ready for the bearing installation or removal and installation. Okay, so here I am back ready to actually do the bearing removal portion of this operation. I've got this ASP engine all disassembled, and boy does this thing feel rough. Now if you can see here, I'm not entirely certain at this point if that is part of the bearing outer race or if that's part of the engine case. So I'm not really sure how that rear bearing is going to come out. So I've got my standard punch, my Boca bearing, miniature bearing puller tool, just in case I can't pull that, or if that is stuck in the front housing, my Delrin block, and my hammer, and of course my heat gun. So let's go ahead and heat this thing up and get these bearings out, and then we can install a new set for this. You know, the one thing I didn't think about is this front housing design is going to make it so that I have to brace this in here as such. Let me close this up real quick so I can hold this in here, hold this front housing very gently here, and that's probably how we're going to have to tap that out. So let's see if that crankshaft's going to come out here now. There we go. So now I can open this back up again. That thing is rather warm, and it looks like the bearing did come off on the crankshaft. Stand by 1 second and I'll show that to you. So yeah, bearing came off on the crankshaft, which is an ideal situation. I'm just going to leave that there for now. We won't be needing that. I'm trying to figure out if I'm going to need my glove for that. I think it's probably in my best interest to do that. So yeah, you can see this is very much like an OS, some older OS designs where the bearing sits in there in a very shallow portion of the housing. So a lot of the alignment of that case is the outer bearing. Wow, that is being quite stubborn here. There we go. There. So there's our bearing, rear bearing. Now let's, I wonder if this is going to be too hot for me to hold. I don't know, hopefully not. I'm going to set it right here in this little area and just do this with it. And that bearing's coming off already. It's going to need one more tap here, I think. 3 or 4 more. All right, so there we go. Wow, that is a rough looking bearing. Not only is it a rough looking bearing, it's a rough feeling bearing. This one is equally rough and bad. So I'm gonna go and get this crankshaft all cleaned up and this front housing, and we'll come back and install a new set of Boca bearings in this engine. Okay, so here I am back. I've got this crankshaft all nice and cleaned up, and I've got the front housing cleaned up and ready to accept some bearings. So one of the first things I like to do is lubricate these items and the bearings themselves, and one of the product I use primarily for doing bearing installations and engine reassemblies is Boca's product Lightning Lube Road Power. Now this bottle is really getting close to emptying. I think I just shook some all over the place, but I usually just put a little squirt in my glass jar and dispense it with a finger. Get it all over all the mating surfaces and everything else I can reach with my finger. I like doing it with my finger just because I can feel. I mean, I could just dunk everything in there too, but this works for me. So let me wipe my fingers off here real quick. Let's pull these bearings out. So I've got a little T-pin here and the old bearings and this screwdriver, because I'm going to have to remove some shields on it, and one of the shields on the small bearing here has got a clip, which is why I'm going to be using the T-pin. So this bearing set for the ASP 40 engine is kit number ENK-006. I had a hard time reading it there because the bags are in the way. ENK-006. And that consists of an MR 6902, which is a pretty standard rear bearing for 40 size engines, and then this was a MR 607 ZZC PS2, which is usually a little bit smaller on the inner diameter and thickness than some. A lot of these 40 size engines use R6 bearings, which are a little bit larger diameter on the ID and thicker. So this bearing doesn't need anything done to it. This is a phenolic race, so this is completely open already. So I don't need to do anything to that, so I don't need this. This, however, is a different story. This is that little 607 bearing, and actually, no, this one looks like it's got a standard. This one does not have a clip on it. And you can tell, if I hold this up here, see all the little like little holes around the outer shield? That is indicative of just a standard metal shield. If you don't see all those little perforations or holes around the outside edge of the shield, it means it's got a clip. I could have swore I must have been looking at another set of bearings just the other day and saw that that one had a clip on it. I thought this was the one, but it's not. So now we're just going to remove one of these. And this is how you remove these shields. You just kind of get in there between the inner race and that shield and push down and pull it out. So let me get a little bit of lubricating oil all over surfaces of these bearings, and we'll get these bearings installed, and then I can go and reassemble this engine. Let me wipe my fingers here real quick. These bearings, I mean, just look at the difference between an old nasty looking bearing and a brand new one. I mean, yeah, there's a big difference there. So this isn't going to take a whole lot of heat because this thing is small, so I'll put the front housing, the front bearing in first, and then what I'll do is I'll go ahead and slide this bearing on here, if I can get it to go on there straight. Just slide that in place just like that. Look at that. Look at that bearing action. That's beautiful. So this should be a quick and easy installation here. So let me just put this here, and hopefully I can heat this up without blowing it off my table. And that thing is so small, I don't think it's going to take a whole lot of heat to get that thing warmed up enough to put these bearings in. Front one is seated, pretty warm. Let's just quickly do that. Now, as I said in the first portion, this thing is not going to recess all the way in there. It's just going to go in probably maybe 1/8 of an inch or so, if even that. Let's see. Okay, about 50% of the distance between, or the thickness of the race itself, I think. Yeah. Let's. It's got a little tolerance issue there. So sometimes you encounter that. There's a little bit of tolerance issue there between that crankshaft and that front housing. Look at that. That'll wear in as the engine gets reassembled and started up. So there you have it. New bearings installed for this ASP 40 engine.